I'm talking from Oslo, from my home in Oslo. I'm actually having an office day, but at home. Usually I work in the Office of Contemporary Art in Oslo, in Norway, and I've been here for 6 years. And before that I was working in other parts of the world, in Switzerland, in England, and in Spain. But one of the main jobs that I have to do here is how to find ways of making the stories that come out of this part of the world relevant, or find the connectivity between what's going on in the rest of the world. And one of the main areas in which we've been doing that is actually in relation to the indigenous community of this region. But we're also engaging more and more with other aspects of the community. And at the bottom line of all of this is really, how do we consider the matter of social justice within our institutions? How do we transform our institutions? And I'm looking forward to talking more about that. But that's, in a nutshell, that's the kind of context within which we're working. Of course, we have many responsibilities to the entire visual arts community in Norway. But we're constantly rethinking, what does that mean? You know, what does that mean with the changing demography? What does that mean with the changing set of relations that this community has with its neighbors? What does a neighbor mean in the entire world, actually? You know, why is a neighbor maybe only just the other side of the border? Maybe the neighbor is in a much bigger way. But yeah, those are the main issues some of the main issues that we've been working on.
I would like to begin from the fact that it's not at all new for us to work from home, because we together as partners in life and work, we have been all the time trying to understand how our house would be the first place from where we can rethink our artistic practice. And in that sense, we established already in 2007 an art collective called Dar, and Dar in Arabic means home, and comes for Decolonizing Architecture, Art, and Residency. And it was a moment where we found ourselves living in Palestine with the born of our first daughter, and we decided we need, in that sense, neighbors. We need family. We didn't want to raise our daughter within one nuclear family between me and Alessandro, and we decided we would like her to live within much more an extended idea of what the world is, and to also put it short, to be loved beyond the love that me and Alessandro are giving her. It's like how she can understand that love is an extended love, right? So we decided to go to Palestine, which was not an easy choice, because also paradoxically a lot of friends and families would look at you and ask you, are you sure you want your kids to live under occupation? Which was quite a question, but matter of fact, we managed in all this very messy situation in Palestine to create in our house, as also two parents with tiny kids, that we had to deal with the situation of what does it mean and how can we both be working? Because in that sense, it's very easy sometimes when you work together, what does it mean and how this would be a collaboration, who would be taking care of what? And it was very easy and almost natural response to it is that why don't we turn our house into the space from where we can think together, and therefore we can take care of the house together rather than being both in the public and struggling with actually managing the house. So it felt like almost a natural situation, and at a certain point we began even to open our house to other people that wanted access to Palestine and to knowledge from Palestine. And we opened it mainly to architects and artists. And we decided we would like to work together. And we created a bit of this situation where people would come, live together with us, because we had also spaces in Palestine. They lived together with us normally 3 to 4 months, and we begin to think together. And this from our side, definitely was helping into creating an intellectual community and breaking our isolation in Palestine. But for the guests that were coming to visit us, it was also a complete different access to Palestine. So they were confronted already with a frame of decolonization, with a way of thinking, with the community with whom they had to deal with. And it was a sort of a situation where reciprocally we were giving much to each other in many ways. And it felt that there was a lot of very interesting reciprocal help into how you break your own I have to say stereotypes and limitations. And it was super nice to understand how you work, because as I am Palestinian, so it's also part of my introduction, and Alessandro is Italian, and we came to decolonization from a complete two different conditions. One, in my case, I had been, I being Palestinian, I'm the colonized, if that makes any sense. And Alessandro comes out of an Italian background where Italians sort of almost never processed fully neither the colonization or the decolonization that they have been historically doing. And we found ourselves confronting each other of what decolonization might mean for us. And I have to say that it was an amazing openness in our case, because at least speaking about me, this actually helped me sort of also bypassing my fears, because sometimes being colonized, all what you are trying to do is to protect the narration, because you are worried that the world is taking away this narration, and this protection might also be a cage at a certain point. And being with people I trust fully, and in that sense, you know, we established it both with Alessandro, but also Eyal Weizman, that he's an Israeli in his case, coming from colonization from a complete different manner. Now, I think that we helped very much each other to bypass our fears and limitations. And it was a very interesting collaboration in terms of creating for each other's minds a space where we felt safe to decolonize our minds. And this is exactly all happened inside an intimate place like our house. And then I have to say that it was a completely experience that in many ways, I felt while we are doing it, that I am in the process of decolonizing my mind together with people I trust and I love. And it is still like this for me, but managing to create this within an intimate space was absolutely an incredible experience. And now we are in a moment of thinking, how can we produce this way of decolonization also in other contexts, and what does that mean, and how we actually take it a bit broader beyond Palestine. So a bit, this is where we are in this moment, and this is why we are in Sweden in this exact moment, and maybe we will come back to it later.
Yeah, it's always a challenge. One has to introduce herself or himself, because, you know, the tendency is always to rely on certain particular moments. Maybe rather what I thought that from the beginning, when Nada proposed this dialogue, it was more maybe a moment in which we can share some of the questions that we are asking ourselves, and some of the issues that we are dealing, you know, in this specific moment of our life. Thinking more that it's part of a long trajectory that, as Sandy also has explained, you know, in more recent history, has been mainly centered on Palestine. And I mean, that is important for us because it also locates a specific way of understanding a practice in relation to a specific struggle, that is the struggle for the liberation of Palestine. And in that sense, I also explain why Sandy also brought decolonization as one of the very important horizon towards which we have been working in the last decades. But also now that we are not there anymore, there are also somehow some of the questions maybe changed and they tuned differently. At the same time, maybe in a strange way also I felt that we feel even more uprooted here in some forms, even though I'm from Italy, therefore from the south of Europe, so not completely European, but still, from the periphery of Europe. And therefore, for me, the questions, becomes important to try to engage with is what kind of knowledge is produced in a site of dislocations. And that is a conditions in which somehow I had the feeling that it's not only maybe what we have been trying to articulate since we have been working together, but also it's a conditions that it's common to many other people that for several reasons, they find themselves maybe in a different context that they were not born into. And therefore they always have that sort of tensions, with the site, where maybe not necessarily are sharing the same language, are not necessarily have the specific maybe local knowledge. And that is for me a way, and that is the kind of questions that we're trying to articulate more recently, in understanding in which way one can, despite that form of alterity or their form of positionality, one can actually build a common conditions that is based on the fact of even not belonging to the site itself. And that feeling of not belonging, and the way I see it, is also a specific political maybe conditions, and even I would say a political aspirations, because all nationalism and the nation state formation were based on the opposite, on the idea of belonging, on the idea of forming these artificial notions that you belong to that specific nations. And in our own work and through our own experiences, I guess one of the important anchors is how one can actually develop a practice that it's actually funded on this notion of non-belonging, and therefore maybe also bringing in the notion of not normalizing and not considering the present as something to be accepted, or something that is somehow reinforcing the status quo, but rather always working on this on a transformative practice that somehow challenge the presence and trying to imagine in the presence different possibilities, trying to work within the cracks of the present, trying to point out maybe possible practice in the present that's trying to challenge what is considered to be normal. So these are some of the elements that I feel we brought with us from our experience of practicing in Palestine, and now that we are situated in a different space, maybe in another, if you like, periphery of Europe, because the north also is not the center of European, epistemologies in some ways. It's always also in another form a sort of peripheral positions. But from this peripheral positions are also ways in which we tend to locate ourselves, both maybe physically and conceptually, which can be called a sort of thinking from the border. The idea that is never trying to claim a specific territories, that can be a discipline or can be, a certain understanding of the arts, but rather somehow continuing of understanding how to profane the sort of divisions that we tend to create either between nation state or among disciplines, or simply among ways in which people constitute their own territories to exercise certain powers. So I hope that this is also in a way to trying to describe some of the ourselves, maybe in a way that is maybe both linked to some of the open questions, but also some of the very strong principles or conditions that we like to continue to engage with. What does it mean, therefore, thinking from the border? What does it mean, therefore, producing knowledge from a position of dislocations, from a position of being, when I was in Palestine, I was the ajanib, the foreigner. And instead of looking at that only as a position of marginality or as a position of, wanting to transform and trying to fit, in any kind of situations, I'm wondering how to articulate, that position also as a specific artistic and political practice, that somehow it doesn't aim to normalize and try to, integrate into a specific conditions, but rather to, to think itself from that dislocation.
Thank you, Alessandro, because that gives me a thread to start, pulling on, and maybe to weave back to some of the points that Sandy also brought up. And I think one of the reasons Nada brought us together is precisely because we're both from different kind of situations, but sharing some interests. I think we're both working with the idea of transformation in one way or another. So our practices are really looking at how do we transform whatever context that we're in. And for me, one of the things that struck me the most when I first came to Norway was that, and that was in 2014, was that there was still a very, in the art scene at least, there was still a great sense of divide between Oslo, the capital, and the north, for example. And people were still talking about this idea of center-periphery, even within the sort of nation state of Norway. And for me, I found that so incredibly irritating. And for me, one of the starting points, for our institution is that I really refuse to think in terms of center and periphery. And I really do think that there are multiple centers. So one thing that happens when you go in Norway up north, when you go to Tromsø, which is meant to be like the Arctic capital, or when you go to other sort of communities, Sami communities, you find that in dialoguing with their perspectives and in learning more about their epistemologies, they have a whole series of networks that, for example, Oslo doesn't even know about, is totally ignorant about, and that creates their own very widespread region across the whole world, actually. So for me, that is really one of the foundational things that we've been trying to work with in our institution as an institution, to break down this idea of center and periphery. And then a lot of things sort of, come from there. But one of the things that I also wanted to say is that what I find interesting in what both of you are saying, Sandy, you started out explaining very clearly how much of your practice really grew from a very sort of personal circumstance from your life. And now, and that, has given you incredible new ways of thinking. And now you find yourself in Stockholm, and in Stockholm you are in a rather different situation, because Alessandro is in the academy. You're working more from your home, from your private circumstances. So there's kind of a to and a fro. You were a duet in a very kind of private environment when you were back in Palestine. Now there are these kind of multiple positions, and I remember last time we were talking, Sandy, you were expressing some of the challenges that gives. With Alessandro being in the academy, with the sort of hegemonies around that, and with the division that has created in the intellectual coupling of your work. And that's, enables me to sort of really begin to think about what can be done from the institution, and how can the institution also become a more private, in the sense that you were talking about it, Sandy, a more private place. So how does the institution transform itself to do that? And I find relevance there in the work that we're doing, because it is quite a challenge in the Office of Contemporary Arts. We are We are an institution created by the Ministries of Culture and Foreign Affairs in 2001. From the beginning, though, we were always quite a different institution to some of the other sister agencies, working with music or other fields, because from the beginning, there was always going to be a more curatorial program. So we were a hybrid in a way. We had a side of us, we still have a side of us, which is to do with research, investigation, discourse, curatorial programming, and another side of us, which is far more establishment, more institutional, which is to do with grants, giving out support grants for international travel, residencies. And these really fit the ministerial way of working. We have very little possibility of, of interfering with those kind of structures, although we do try in some ways. So there is schizophrenia to some extent in OCA about how these two things work. And what I do find is that over the years, the ways in which we've been able to strengthen the curatorial side, the discourse building, the knowledge creation on the one side of the institution has at least had an impact on the more sort of structural aspects of the other side of the institution. So, in 2014, when we first, when I first arrived, just the numbers of artists approaching OCA for support internationally from the Afro-Norwegian community, from the diasporic community, from the indigenous community was pretty low. And one of the things that our curatorial program has done is to build greater networks and greater possibilities, I think, for those communities. So that is a kind of structural transformation that we've managed to achieve. But there's another kind of transformation. A lot of people, when they talk about, you started out talking about decolonization, and immediately I was thinking, okay, decolonization, what is it for all of us, decolonization? Is it the same thing? And who should be doing decolonization, and for whom should decolonization be taking place? And the reason why I say that is because I've come to see that there's lots of answers actually to that question. There's not one answer, there's lots of answers. Because, for the indigenous community in this part of the world, actually what they're striving for is indigenization, which is coming from a different perspective. It's about centering their perspectives, wherever that may be, in our institution too. And it's often said that decolonization is actually something that should be done. It's the responsibility of the hegemonizers to do that, whether the hegemonizers are the white community or whoever they may be, because there's lots of different hegemonizers in the world, but that it's their responsibility to decolonize. On the other hand, Sandy, I also agree with what you said, that actually all of us, whether it's the indigenous community, the Afro-Norwegian community, or myself, we also have been molded and structured, with kind of colonial straitjackets. So we also have a responsibility to work on decolonizing ourselves. And I know that this is a discussion we've held a lot with our Sami peers, and there's a lot of internal colonization still, which is invisible, but it kind of works in the favor of the colonial structures that still persist in Norway. So when going back to this idea of transformative practices, how do we enact our transformative practices, whether it's in, you, Alessandra, in the academy, that's one thing I'd love us to talk a bit about, or Sandy, now you come into Stockholm, and how you want to continue to, work on those relations between the guest and the host, and the private space, and how does that interfere with the public space? How does that become an empowering tool in inserting itself in the public space? I think those are really pursuing similar interests or similar urgencies that we feel in our institution. I think last time I was talking about, like three Ps, I call them the 3 Ps. 3 Ps, how we approach the 3 Ps in OCA, the 3 Ps being publics, programs, and personnel. And very often when decolonization is raised, in the cultural scene, in the arts scene, is considered purely from the perspective of programs. Okay, we're going to decolonize our programs. We're going to bring in more practitioners from different kinds of communities. But of course, I think we would agree that that is quite a superficial way of approaching the situation, that what we really are looking for is structural transformation, structural decolonization. And we are on some kind of a path in that direction. It's taking time because it's also means, it requires means. So at the moment in Oka, we have now 2 Sami peers working for us in responsible positions, whether they are curatorial or communications. And our juries distributing the grants have a permanent seat for a Sami peer, and we're beginning to develop a 2-year program with colleagues from the Afro-Norwegian community to address some of the similar issues that we started addressing with our Sami peers. So these are structural changes. However, I have a limited contract in Oka. My contract runs out in 2 years. And it's very important that, when I leave, these are not changes that can be reversed by the next director who may come in with different interests. So how do you make permanent such structural changes? And one of the ways in which we are trying to do that is actually establish a dialogue with the ministries so that our statutes can change, and that in our statutes, we don't just talk about how we work with regards to the Norwegian arts community, but we're also able to introduce the word Sami. Now, we started that dialogue almost 2 years ago, and it's very slow and very difficult. But we're really aiming at trying to get that changed within the next year or 2 years. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there for the moment. But I think there's, when we're thinking about how will we return, I do think we will, it's up to us to make sure that we will not return to business as usual. I've heard different people in institutions in different parts of the world saying, oh, just can't wait to get back, to business as usual. Even ministers talking about this. But I was so happy to hear Francis Morris from the Tate Modern the other day saying that those who think that we can go back to business as usual have to think again. And she was really putting on the table questions to do with how museums work with regards to climate change, how all of those touring exhibitions that are traveling all over the world, that needs to be rethought, re-strengthening the local, for example. That's just from a museum perspective. But I really think it's each one of us individual responsibility to make sure, in fact, that we don't go back to normal, that we don't keep normalizing all of these situations, as Sandra, you said at one point.
I want to maybe begin with this institutional framework, and you asked the question what institution can do and how can we operate differently, and I would like to share my own experience with the Public Art Agency in Sweden, for example, and what really happened in my case that was quite an interesting way of the institutions open up for certain things that were a bit unimaginary for myself, right? And in that sense, when they invited me and they created a bit of a condition, when we arrived to Sweden, a bit of same period that Alessandro got his position here at the university, I was commissioned by the Public Art Agency for 2 years to work in the North. And they had these programs of how to work with marginalized communities. And in a sense, I have to say that I was unable to imagine what is it that is expecting me, how can I even operate in a condition that I do not know, and if this is even right to do, right? Because you ask yourself, who am I to go and begin to sort of interfere or work, or am I now the intruder? Not being in Sweden, I pass to the other part. But in a sense, when I arrived to Boden for the first time, I realized immediately that I didn't even got it, because being a Palestinian, I have all the time played on the other part. So I mean, arriving there, I arrived as the artist sent from the center, right? And in that sense, you mentioned also that there is a bit of there is a huge difference between Oslo and the north. Same here. I arrived there, and you imagine people were waiting for me as sent by the public art agency, as sent by the government, as sent by the center, right? And of course, I did not at all see myself this way, but all what was happening around me to arrive there, have journalists that wants to interview me, and all these things were completely strange things to me. And they were interviewing me as an artist sent by the government. And at a certain point, I was with the community, they were moving around, showing me things, and they asked me about myself. And I say, I am, I immediately say, I'm a Palestinian artist. And they immediately bit freeze. And I saw that they freeze. And in order to calm them, because in their mind, I was the artist center from the center. So how come I am Palestinian? No, what is going on here? They didn't even imagine that I would be. So I broke, by me being there, I break immediately what they think that the artist sent from the government should be, right? So, and I noted this, and my reaction to this was so surprising to myself. I told them, no worries, but I was trained in Italy. So, I defended myself, and I thought, what the heck? And after that, it took me a while thinking why I had to calm them down and told them I am also Italian, because I felt that they were super anxious about me being Palestinian, and what does that mean? Then I sort of say, but no worries, I know your language. I am, that, and in that sense, maybe I have to say, I have to bring the whole language of modernism. It's like, I want to tell them, I know what artists should be doing in there, and I can perform, right? But then I immediately understood that what I can be doing there is a completely different things and huge scale, exactly because I have the backup of the institution. So in that sense, it was the perfect crack, I have to say, because from one side, I immediately identify myself with all refugees in Boden. I speak the language that they speak. I feel myself displaced in Sweden. I was very worried about what does it mean for me to be a guest in Sweden. I was very worried about what I will be doing with my life after the third day of Sweden. And the whole project that I created there was based on how my fourth day in Sweden would look like. And we have in Arabic is that the guest is respected for 3 days as a guest. He has the aura of being a guest. He's super respected. But from the fourth day, he or she would become a sadaqa, means pettiness. No, in that sense, people would not. If you would accept your role as a guest, you would not be respected as the first 3 days, but you would be treated as someone that needs help, that needs relief, that needs to be shown how to live better, that needs to be disciplined, that needs to understand how you would be behaving in the public spaces. And my main concern was, what does it mean for me to arrive to my fourth day in Sweden? And I have to say that I immediately identify with all temporary people that were sent to the north, and they were not able to understand what to do with their fourth day. But the main difference, that I was sent by the government. I was sent by what is considered in the eyes of everyone, the permanency, right? So I was a bit of a combination of temporariness by my own self and feelings and emotions and personal story. But in the same time, at that point, the Public Art Agency gave me a structure through which I reacted. I managed to do certain things in Boden that now we opened up a living room there for refugees that maybe I can tell after. But in a sense, I think that I thought if I would have gone alone with Alessandro and the girls in Boden for other 10 years, would I have been able to do the same impact I did in Boden by the invitation of the Public Art Agency? And my answer was no. It is not the same. has nothing. And in this, the question is that each time, what are the contexts you are in, and how you use this context in order to transform public and private, in order to, and I understood that without being sent by the public art agency there, I would have been able only to perform as migrant. And I would have been trapped into my one vest, while the invitation from the public art agency gave me two vests that I was able to really shift so many things, among them my own mind and my own practice and my own way of doing. And this only to end, you know, the whole project sort of departure from the moment I visited a Syrian architect that was living there. It was referred to me by some people, and I was with members from the public art agency that were curating the project, and I entered in the house of Yasmin and Brahim in their living room. And suddenly I saw certain proudness of them hosting us, and in that sense also hosting these members of the public art agency as representatives of the Swedish government. And for me, this was a super moment where I thought, oh my God, what needs to be seen as guests forever in Sweden of these two refugees are hosting with such pride the Swedish government, right? And in that sense, it is from there where I thought, how can we keep this pride also in the public life? How can we actually break certain things and demand our right to host and not accept to be a guest forever? And I guess that in this tiny living room in Boden, I realized that what I misses the most from Palestine is our living room, is our home, is Dar, is what we created together, is how we created a public space in our house that would host certain discussions that we were unable to do in the public. And in that sense, I thought, how can we bring this living room? The living room would shift differently. Maybe questions would shift, urgencies would shift. But how can we still be demanding our right as individuals to sort of shift and model public spaces in a way that we can act as actors and not only as guests? And in a sense, this was a bit of a major break for me, right? Understanding how from that position of guest, of being only guest, understand that what I miss and what I would never give up with is my right to host.
I would like to try just maybe as quick as possible to maybe touch upon three aspects that you mentioned. You know, one, it was the how decolonization is not understood as one specific way of a practice or thinking, but how maybe in Mignolo's term, you know, what are the colonial options? I think that is one thing I would like just to elaborate a little bit more. You also, the second thing is these questions, how to make permanent these structural changes that you're trying to make. And I think that also I would like just to share some ideas and some reflections. And the last one is on this questions of how we will return, drawing on a very loaded notions of return that we engage with, which is in Palestine. And that was how refugees, you know, what does it mean for a Palestinian refugees returning after 70 years? So the first is how important is that decolonization will not become a kind of fashionable term, and how will not become another department in academia, you know, how will not become in some ways, you know, codified in which everyone should agree on how it is practiced. So for me, the powerful ways of using decolonization as a frame to understand the present is, first of all, understanding that the present is built of 500 years of colonizations. So we are all embedded, no one is excluded. And that is also, of course, the challenge, you know, to bring such a conversations in the Nordic countries, because they don't see themselves, you know, as colonizing countries. But of course, as we know, colonizations operate also internally or inside the nation state. In that sense, the North, you know, it was a form how Sweden and Finland and Norway dealt with the North. What they're considered the North was was a colonial relations, you know, extractions, you know, the classical way of in which, you know, the colonizer understood people that were inferior to them. No, so there is, I think, an important work that, as you mentioned, needs to be done is actually from these very institutions that have to realize that their legacy is built on this long project of 500 years of knowledge has been produced that has divided the world among races, you know, underdeveloped, developed. No one is excluded from this. And then the question will be then how to decline the term of decolonizations in which it makes sense for different groups and different individuals in relation to their, you know, in which way they are invested into this, you know, much bigger machine that's been produced, you know, since centuries. For example, in the ways which we started to articulate it here, which is different from Palestine, where in a sense we are still in Palestine, what is present, and this is the, you know, today is the 1st of July and was the, let's say, the time in which the Israeli government should announce the annexations of part of Palestine. I mean, that is, let's say, 18th century, 19th century form of colonization. No, it's not even, you know, the more sophisticated form of coloniality of today. That is a very old-fashioned colonization, which is, you know, land grabs, displacement, genocides, spatiocide. I mean, all very old-fashioned of understanding, you know, there. So therefore, for us, you know, decolonization in Palestine was essentially reduced, you know, how you oppose to the colonial regime and how, you know, you intervene against something that, for me, it's pretty self-evident, you know, and to be called somehow colonization. However, moving, you know, the kind of lens or the kind of practice within Europe that, of course, was the center of this project, in a sense, that has been developed since 500 years. The struggle, I think, it's much closer to knowledge, and therefore is much more maybe close to decolonizing knowledge. And this also, to answer to your questions, what I think I'm doing inside an educational institution is, you know, thinking about teaching as a form of activism, you know, understanding that we also have to operate within the institutions and bringing, you know, a discourse in the place where knowledge is produced. And that is, for me, another form, you know, in which I see myself, my practice and teaching as a continuations, you know, and how it transformed itself into teaching as a form of activism and decolonizing knowledge as maybe the center of that, you know, from the position where I'm standing. And more particularly, how, in that sense, in architecture, more than decolonization, what becomes for me more sharp is thinking about a project of demodernizations, which means challenging, you know, modernism. Modernism in architecture is still today understood, you know, as progressive, you know, socialist, egalitarian project, utopian egalitarian project, you know, without, of course, understanding, you know, the dark side that modernism had in Europe and, of course, beyond Europe itself, as essentially the other phase or the twin project, you know, together with colonization. Will not exist colonization without, in that sense, form of modernism and modernization, and how modernism understands history, progress, you know, all this kind of concept device that, you know, are still very much used here. So this is just to draw on this first point of how one can operate on the notion of decolonization in so many different ways. And I think the big lesson is that we don't have to trap ourselves in trying to agree or trying to codify, you know, what we mean in one, because that meaning, it's important that we ask, what does it mean to decolonize? But this is different in different contexts. And I think that is something that it's important to recognize and maybe to acknowledge and be articulated. Maybe quickly, if I don't take too much time, is I think also this very important question that you ask is how to make the changes that in your specific case you're trying to do in the museum to become permanent. And there I would like maybe to articulate these questions that resonate with some of the things that we have been doing, and more particularly also for me now that I'm at the Royal Institute of Art, you know, how will be my teaching something that can not become permanent, because what I'm afraid, you know, about the permanency that then become a model and then, you know, become something that needs to be reproduced and therefore, you know, perpetuating a form of hegemony that I will not be interested in. But rather the issue would be how we can show that we can do things that were unthinkable before. And I think that produces a situations that then people after us can say, but this has been done. You know, this has been inspirational for thinking, you know, that this was possible, for example, to use the institutions, you know, in that sort of direction. And that I feel can produce, you know, a form of change that is lasting, because in a way then would be impossible to come back, because you already showed, you know, that was actually possible. And maybe just a footnote to a very also personal and important aspect that you mentioned, how also change, you know, in our practice, you know, me being in institutions, and how, for example, in the moment that I move in institutions, I was forced to individualize my practice, you know, and I was forced, for example, one big change institutions have to think, they have to recognize, and especially the art world I'm thinking about, you know, it's this incapacity to recognize collectives, you know, that people, in a way, a practice has always to be reduced to individuals. You have to be individualized. So you can have, your position is an individual position. It cannot be a collective position. So I think that is you know, one of the specific problems. For example, if one imagine that one can actually hire a collective instead of a person, that, for example, is something that will be difficult to undo. That is what, you know, another way to say this is a permanent change in a sense. No, it's not permanent in a way then, you know, one has to be forced to hire collectives, but to say, look, there are not just individuals that can be hired, but an institution has to change in order to, you know, embrace practices that are artistic practices that are actually done collectively, in which there is no, you know, idea of authorship, but actually there is a more, you know, a collective understanding and a collective practice. And this is where institutions need actually to react.
I just want to thank you both, because I really feel so excited about the way this is going. I really feel we could really talk about this for a long time in really fantastic ways. But I want to come back to something that you were saying, Alessandro, when you were talking about you know, colonization and Mignolo and his, you know, way of thinking about this. And, you know, one of the issues I may have with Mignolo is the fact that he really positions, you know, colonization as something kind of stemming back to 1492, and hence the sort of 500 years sort of time frame. And I think, you know, this really depends on which part of the world you are thinking about. But, you know, from the sort of Nordic perspective, actually the first instances, written instances that we have of, you know, the beginnings of those waves, because it came in waves of, you know, outsiders coming in, infringing, you know, beginning to place their tentacles into this region, you know, stem back to the Roman Empire. So, you know, we're talking about over 1,000 years. You know, I think for the Sami people, the experience of colonization has been very long and in waves, and, you know, deepening and deepening every time. And now it's kind of, you know, in many ways deeper than ever. But I also wanted to talk about, you know, you mentioned decolonization and how it has all these different levels to it, and that it's certainly not one fixed term. And I think this is such an important thing to you know, to emphasize. And I'm just thinking about the Nordic region and the fact that, you know, the way the Nordic region has, through its nation states kind of, you know, version, the way it has presented itself to the world, particularly since the sort of World War II, the way it has invented itself, its narrative, how it's positioned that narrative in the world has been very much based on this idea of a sort of social democratic set of nations with a very egalitarian welfare system. Of course, what that has done is that it has, in a way, advanced the notion of equality within society, but from a very particular nation-state perspective. Because if we look back at what was being discussed in the 60s and 70s with regards to equality, it's like, yes, you know, Sami people were equal to Norwegians as long as they behaved and operated, labored, related to others, to the land, etc., in the same way as the Norwegians would. That was defined as equality. So this false notion of equality is something that needs to be deconstructed within any kind of decolonial practice, and that's certainly something very important for this part of the world. And particularly from, if I'm really, you know, thinking now from the Sami perspective, a lot of people would say that, you know, after the late 70s, you know, after the big Sami uprisings against the building of the Alta Dam, which has gone down in, you know, I would say canonical Nordic history as being the moment when Norway, for example, joined the ILO Convention 169 in recognition of indigenous rights, and that the Norwegian government therefore started some kind of process of recognition. It meant that, you know, there was some investment in the beginnings of an infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I mean, you know, a Sami university, Sami museums, Sami Artists Union, you know, this kind of situation. Actually, what is being discussed now in retrospect, looking back at that moment, is that that was another very, I would say perhaps insidious form of colonization, because what that did is it created an apparatus, you know, whether it was universities, museums, or whatever, which were actually based on Nordic models, on colonial models of what it is to build knowledge, to present, disseminate it, you know, transfer it, circulate it when it comes to Sami peers. But it was based on one thing, on the division between culture and land. And from an indigenous perspective, that division doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It does not make sense to speak of Sami cultural perspectives or to speak of indigenous cultural perspectives, you know, from a global perspective, and to divide that from their relation to land. And that is precisely what this infrastructure has done. And that is why we're in such a dangerous moment, why we're in such an urgent moment right now in the Nordic region, but in many other parts of the world too, because, you know, for the Nordic governments, they can say, but, you know, look, we are, you know, we have lots of Sami artists everywhere. They are ambassadors of their culture. We have lots of, you know, museums that are beginning to collect Sami art. But all of this is just emphasizing the division, because there's one thing that they will not enter into a discussion about, which is the sovereignty of the land and how the land and the individual, the land and the body, are intersubstantiated into one. And that is a fundamental premise of indigenous epistemology. So if you want to truly decolonize, you have to recognize indigenous epistemology. And if you recognize indigenous epistemology, you have to recognize the intersubstantiation between those two elements: land, when I say land in the broader sense, water, everything, and the individual. And this brings me to the next point that you made, Alessandro, which was really important to hear your experience there too, which is about academia as the institution and what you can do within that. And I think what you're talking about is incredibly important, setting the precedents so that there is a point of no return. Now, in Oka, you know, it's been now 6 years that we are working in collaboration with our Sami peers, and very often I get Norwegian peers coming to me and saying, okay, Katja, so you've done the Sami thing, you've done it now. You know, can't you move on? When are you going to move on? And I find it such a sort of laughable question, because it's almost like saying, oh, well, we've done democracy, let's move on now. What's the next one? How can you ever move on? You know, the fact is that this should be something which is integral. So the whole point of institutional transformation is to make it integral from the center, to center it so that it's continuously there into the future. And I was talking the other day with a Sami scholar. She's completing her PhD at the Oslo University. And she said something that I think will interest you both, because She is in her third year. She's called Lisa Ravna Finbok, and she's doing a PhD on museology from an indigenous perspective. And she's been, talking to her supervisors almost from day one, saying to them, but, from a Sami methodological perspective, to write your sort of PhD with the one voice in a kind of, printed manner, if that is the only space that you are giving me, then I'm not really able to center my, Sami stories and my Sami methodologies. If you're only allowing my singular voice to be the one credited and, gaining that authorship, you are really disintegrating my position, my belief, and my knowledge of what a Sami methodology is. So she was proposing to her supervisors that she would be allowed, first of all, that parts of her PhD were oral and they were not written. And secondly, that it would be a collective process. So she wouldn't be the singular owner of this credit, of this PhD. And of course, they did not listen to that, and she's being forced to do something in this very kind of rigid colonial structural way. But it brings me to another point that you raised, Alessandra, which was the question of demodernization. And I think that's also really important. If you're thinking about transformation, if you're thinking about decolonization, you also have to think about demodernization, or at least challenging what the narrative of modernity, modern art history, for example, or modern architectural history has been. And this became very apparent to me the other day when another Indigenous colleague, she's called Kimberly Moulton, she's a Yorta woman in Australia, and she works in the Victoria Museum, she's a curator there. We invited her to contribute a text to a publication that we're making on the Maza Yuafko. Now, the Maza Yuafko was, again, in the canon of Nordic history, it's the first Sami artist collective. And it's very interesting, this term, the first Sami artist collective. Of course, it's a term that is understood within the language of modernism, artists collectivizing, how that operates. But what Kimberly was mentioning in her essay is that actually collectivity is a central epistemological practice in indigenous communities. So for those artists in the 70s to have to call themselves a Sami artist collective was simply done so that the language of modernism, which was all around them, would recognize them. But actually collectivity is the essence of being Sami, for example. So yeah, I think all of these are ways of decolonizing our knowledge, which will hopefully also transform our institutions.
Who is responsible for creating socially engaged public arts? Is it the Minister of Culture that decided that she wants to make her nice way of working in marginalized spaces? Is it the artist? Or is it Yasmin and Brahim that accepted to work with the artist? Is it the public art agency that, and I came to them and I say, I feel responsible. You, Minister of Culture in Sweden, do you feel responsible for this creation of something that people want to continue and wants to do? And for them, it ends after 2 years and the mandate is done. So I am questioning now, I am in this moment of my practice to say, I'm questioning your responsibility. What does that mean? Is it okay that from a desire of a Minister of Culture, it is on the shoulders of 2 refugees living in the north of Sweden that they are fulfilling what the Minister of Culture wants? And is this whole thing really, are you realizing that this is happening, right? So I'm really now sort of trying to use, with the same way that the institutions is asking me as an artist to be responsible, I'm asking them back to be responsible for their acts. And in that sense, I have a feeling that it doesn't, because they give funds and it seems that funds is enough. They feel that the exchange of responsibility is only by providing funds, which is not the real thing. So I'm also opening up responsibilities and who is the responsible, and if we want to still be creating public art or socially engaged art outside, then what is it? Are the artists the ones that are fully responsible, and are they creating their machines in order to drive them forever, or they can be moving differently from one place to another? So it is a very strong question that also we had when we moved from Palestine. Everybody was asking us, what will happen with what you produced in Palestine? What would happen with campus in camps? What would happen with Dar? What would happen with this? And as if you have the creation and you decide to imprison yourself with something that others consider sort of successful, and therefore you should go in loop with this around yourself. And in a sense, because I am outside of Palestine, this question of responsibility becomes way clearer for me, because I took a distance and I'm looking from far away and questioning, arrive to a point that I can even question the responsibility of the Minister of Culture in a place like Sweden. And I feel I have nothing to lose to do this. I feel I have the power enough to be able to raise this publicly in Sweden. So this is maybe one. And then to continue with the responsibility and to link this with the acquisition in a place like the Van Abbe Museum, because when we did the living room throughout our retrospective exhibition a year and a half ago, Permanent Temporariness in the Van Abbe Museum, we created the living room because we met the host, Shafiq. Shafiq is a security guard that is working in the Van Abbe Museum, and I met him first when I arrived, and he proposed himself as a host. As soon as I showed him the material from Boden, he says, I want to host. And because he proposed himself as a host, we built the living room at the entrance of the museum, right? And the exhibition ended, and everybody wanted, because he also began to include rejected asylum seekers from Eindhoven, and therefore many people were asking for this project to continue. And the only way that it was possible for it to continue were Charles Esche proposed, should we acquire the living room? And what does that mean? And here I want to come back to collectivity, right? So in a sense, the living room was created out of a very collective, both thoughts, collaborations, hosts, guests, our previous 15 life work together. But matter of fact, everybody wanted the individual artist. Everybody was super happy about having me alone finally doing a project, and that we can claim that you are the artist, right? So, and I was telling Charles, I have a hard problem accepting the acquisition as a thing, because also the acquisition, like in the academia, they ask you to become an individual, to become and then you begin to like, and then he was saying, then you got this money and you can distribute it to Shafiq, Ibrahim and Yasmin if you want, share it with Alessandro. And it felt so bad to me. It's like, why I should, because we learned being in Palestine that the moment you begin to divide money, whatever equality you would ever have, whatever good sense you would ever have, money comes to the collectivity and it ruins it. I mean, I don't know of experiences where people manage to divide properly money. So I was super afraid from getting this money and to begin to divide it around. And I say, Charles, would you explain me what is the game right here? What is it that we are dealing with? And he says, okay, I can tell you this, is we need an artist, first of all. It's preferably, it's good we have an object. We manage a lot to turn around it and to make it more a contract, this and that. We can still be playing around it, but you made my life much easier if there is an object and if there is an artist. And in that sense, this is the way we, they say, fine, you know, and I thought, why not to deal with the acquisition the same way as we dealt with hospitality and understand how it is both private and public. It's both private and collectivity. And what we propose to Charles, that we are now working on, is that you want the artist, I'm happy to play this role as long as this would mean the continuation of the living room in Eindhoven. But you don't give me the money. You sort of acquire the piece for the first time, and the piece would expire each year. Because he says also, he told me, you have your power is in the contract. Once you sign the contract, that's it. It's over with the artist. right? We do whatever you wrote in that contract. And I say, fine, you would acquire the pillows that I wrote with my own hand. So if you want a handwritten by the artist, and so we play by the game. We have the pillows that are written by me, but these pillows would, each time that they would come out in the museum to be shown, they have to put the same amount of money that they paid to the artist to activate the piece. But it's not me that would activate the piece. It is the role of the museum. It is the responsibility of the institutions. And if they do not have funds or capacities or anything, they cannot use the piece. So the pillows would come back to the storage, and in that sense, they would expire once each year. So next year, if Charles would not find the money, he should bring the pillows in the storage, and that's it. Store it as a very normal thing. But what I find in that sense, and the wealth of the artist is also the wealth of the collectivity, because I want this to be linked with the market cost. So in one day, if these pillows would have a higher price, they should put the same exact amount of money for the collectivity each time. So it's the museum that, in order to show the piece, have to provide the activation of the piece. Otherwise, it's not there. And we are finding ourselves in this moment very much struggling with how these collectivity would be transformed into actions, right? Into ways of how I would be happy with my wealth, because any wealth that I would get as an artist would mirror a public wealth, would mirror a collective wealth. How I would see Shafiq, Yasmin, and Brahim, everybody happy about me becoming more and more well-known artist, because this would mean the continuation, the sustainability, the going on of the project. But it should not be me. It should not be me, because if Charles Escher wanted the living room in the Van Abbe Museum, if the Public Art Agency wanted the project in the North, they should also have their share of the responsibility, right? So this is a bit another way of looking at roles of the institutions into the acquisition of these pieces. And what does that mean? And the moment that you should stop yourself even before, am I able to continue with such projects? Because it's very easy to say, look at us, how good we are creating socially engaged public arts, but then we forgot them after 3 years of their creation. So I'm really in this moment of my life, exactly because maybe I am outside of the institutions, I can play the role of that person that is asking and demanding the institutions to take their role into what they participate into their creation, even if they send the artist to create it.
That's an incredible story that you've been telling us, Sandy, because in this process, in this dialogue that you've been having, with the Van Abbe Museum, what you're really pointing to is that, in terms of how shall we return? Well, in returning, I think I'm certainly hoping, a lot of us are hoping, that the structures of, all the organizations in the art world need to be rethought. The museums need to rethink how they are structured, how they operate. It's making me think about the situation here in Norway, for example, when it comes to the National Museum. The National Museum in Norway is building a new building. It's probably going to open in 2022. And in that process, and given that, right now all of these discussions about, Sami perspectives and decolonization, are gaining quite a lot of momentum in this side of the world, they've started acquiring Sami artworks. They had a few pieces from the 80s, but they had stopped completely. And that has created a very interesting situation, because some of those artists, some of those Sami artists, who are now being acquired by the National Museum with a view to that museum opening in 2022 and its, first exhibition proudly being able to show, these Sami artworks. Some of those artists are actually, kind of pushing the museum to rethink what the ownership means for the museum. They are talking about the responsibility that the museum has with regards to those works. They are talking about the life of those works, you know, outside of the hallowed walls of that institution, and how the museum will connect with Sapmi, with the Sami community, with the structures in Sapmi. The fact that there isn't a Sami museum has been promised for more than 40 years, you know, but the day that that comes, you know, the National Museum now is in a position to actually buy out, you know, probably some of the most important works in Sami art history. And it means that when that Sami museum gets built, you know, they won't have those works. They will have been, you know, in a way robbed of those works. So how can a level of co-ownership be built into the system? And this is a very complicated discussion, of course. You know, you're talking about legal terms. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it is for a structure which is so static. You're talking about legal terms, you're talking about what is expected from how a museum operates, and also how the publics are going to engage with those works. You know, because what you're saying is that you didn't want the living room to become an object. You wanted the living room to become something, you know, true to its spirit, something alive, something relational, something, you know, which facilitates, I suppose, the power sharing through it, and with you know, the sort of conviviality that it puts on the table. And I think when we talk about returning, how will we return? I really do hope that some of those big structures like museums are able to rethink how they are going to return, because what you're pointing at is absolutely crucial. We have to move beyond the understanding of a museum almost as a sort of real estate kind of model, which is obsessed with how many meters squared it has, which is obsessed with the number of works that it has in its collection, that becomes the indicator of whether a museum is important or not. But that the structures and the processes of the museum actually move in a very different way, much more towards the kind of dynamics that you're proposing.
I wanted to go back, yes, on these questions about the return, and understanding a little bit these notions, you know, from how it has been articulated in Palestine, you know, what it meant for since the 1948 Nakba, when the Palestinians were displaced from their homes. And the discussion, of course, has been stuck, you know, either between, on one side, Israel negating the return, which is, of course, the right of return is described in international law and should be granted. And then the ways in which that return has been, let's say, articulated simply as some sort of counter positioning is a specific return meant, you know, returning to your house that you lost in 1948. And that rhetoric in some way also imprisoned Palestinian political imagination into the idea that the only return that is possible, or the only return that is politically, let's say, possible, is that you return into that house. But in our conversations, you know, when you go beyond the fact that people that you talk to, they recognize that you also, of course, acknowledge the right of return, then the question, you know, becomes more on how. And when you then ask how, you start to realize and you start to really think about the practicalities of return, which of course you understand that the return to a single individual house is, for the majority of the cases, impossible. Either because that house doesn't exist anymore, because that house, you know, in a way has been changed, demolished, and of course imply the fact, and that is the very painful experience of the exile, you know, the person also changed. So when we started to engage, you know, in these discussions, we also have understood that the necessary work that needed to be done, it was to think about return in plural, you know, imagining possibility of returns. That in the specific case of Palestine, was also trying to open up an imaginations which the return is not simply a return maybe to a specific place that was in the historical Palestine, but also we ask the other questions, which is, what will happen to a refugee camp when you return? And that, for example, shift the conversations in which people realize that that would imply a second Nakba, would imply another catastrophic moment, because people build history on those camps, despite the suffering, despite the fact that they were forced, in those camps. But those lives, they have values, and those spaces, they do have values. And for us, for example, has been incredibly inspiring, thinking then the question is that the return should include the camps, which means that then how you imagine a life that includes the place of origin and the place of exile together. And therefore then become the return in the specific situation. It's more also the right of movement between this. That will, of course, will eliminate, for example, the nation state borders that exist today between the historical Palestine, and, for example, where the other camps are located. So imagining, for example, and being inspired by the ways in which the possibility of how the returns can be imagined, not only, in this utopian idea of going back to a single individual space, but rather how it can be a practice in which one can actually exercise the right to be at two places in the same time, and therefore maybe having two belonging at the same time. Because how you can ask a refugee that has been born in a refugee camp in Lebanon, giving up the fact that he's also Lebanese, of course, but at the same time he's Palestinian. So that kind of double belonging that doesn't fit into a nation state needs to open up to a different political organizations that recognize that that is actually possible. I think it's our incapacity to actually recognize that these are not crazy desire, but actually are very normal desire, and we are incapable of imagining an organizations in which that return would imply the fact that you are not just caging yourself into an idea of a nation state, but rather you are reimagining this geography in which the belonging is a multiple belonging, because that is what has been the experience. Of course, in this case, for me, Palestine is somehow makes things more extreme and clear, but that can be something that can be thought in the same ways in which when we are thinking about the return. There is no return in that sense to the normality, and this is what we hope for. There is no return to what was before, because things have changed, and therefore it's more how one can imagine this multiple idea of returns, that implied also this the place of displacement, and give values also to the experience of displacement.
And maybe I want to finish also, maybe last wrap up is how to, this idea of return and return to where, and maybe to bring back hospitality and colonization. In as a conclusion moment, where I would like also to as exactly Alessandro was speaking about multiple returns, is that how we are full humans only if we manage to exercise our being guest and host in the same moment, and we alternate between both, and to just bring you to think about it from a colonial perspective, and in many ways still remembering my grandmother when she was speaking about British coming to Palestine. She was saying, we sort of had them and welcomed them as our guests, and they act as they are the host master, right? And they never accepted to be guests in our house, and they make us guests in our own houses, right? So in that sense, I would invite to think that if you are unable to be a guest follower in certain moments, because the guest would also requires you to be a follower, would requires you to accept the rules of regulations that other people set, then you have a very colonizer mind. Means that wherever you want to go, no matter where you are and how you are dealing with things, you want to be all the time the one setting the rules and regulations and to play the British host, right? So the British colonial host. While if you are only accepting to be guest forever, as it happened with the living room, for example, and my problem with what happened with me, should I be guest forever in Sweden, means that I accept to be not full citizen, right? I accept the fact that I play the role of someone with not full citizenship and feeling the fact that he is agent and can act. And in a sense, is it ever possible to think about also colonization from a sense of this human desire of both being able to be guest and the host in the same way and moving between these both two things, because both of them require a complete different mindset from each one of us. And this is the way actually we can still be thinking about us being able to move between positions, because the problem is that then, you know, this incapability of moving between positions, what make one all the time demanding his power, and no matter what is it, he doesn't want to give up with this power, right? And what I want to say is that sometimes, you know, when you say people that have privilege will have hard time accepting to give up their privilege, it's true, but sometimes how nice it is to be a guest, you know, how nice it is to be taken by your hand and shown other ways of living, other ways of, so this is where I would say that holding the power all the time, it's not necessarily the best thing ever that someone can have, and how you would bring people on board with you rather than all the time only being completely confrontational and showing them how they are abusing their power, but mainly actually bringing an alliances where we understand that being together might be a great privilege rather than the privilege of holding the power. So I think that this is also another very important struggle we have in front of our eyes in this moment. And I cannot see a possible return to previous life without actually putting this again in front and moving forward of how does it mean to change positions and to accept sometimes that you are a follower and sometimes you are leading, and to move between these both as the way of being a privileged person.